Today, I've got a treat for you. I am sharing 5 easy DIY gift ideas that you can build this weekend. In fact, some of them you can build in half a day, some of them even under an hour. But you do need to wait for the glue to dry on a few of those projects. But all of them make some amazing handmade DIY gift ideas. And that is not it. I am actually teaming up with my friends Shara from Woodshop Diaries and Katie from House Full of Handmade, and they are also sharing 5 ideas each. So that is a total of 15 gift ideas for you to pick from and build this weekend, or build all of them. I will add a link to their YouTube videos in the description below. Before we get started, if you are new here, I am Anika, and my goal is to demystify DIY and inspire and empower you to build all of the things confidently using power tools. I share a ton of project ideas, tool tutorials, and I have a bunch of courses that are perfect for you if you are just starting out. I have links to all of that in the description below, so definitely check those out. And now, let's dive into the first project. Now, project number 1 is a cutting board stand. Now, hardwood cutting boards are beautiful and they look amazing displayed against a backsplash. But what happens when you go to pick one of those cutting boards out? So we're going to build a cutting board stand to solve the problem. Now, whether you are building this stand to give as a gift with another DIY cutting board that you're making, which, by the way, all of those 3 cutting boards that you saw, I have a video showing you exactly how to make them. But you can include the cutting board stand as is if they already have a bunch of cutting boards, or you can include it with a DIY cutting board as a gift. For this project, I am using mahogany. I do have the detailed printable plans with the schematics and dimensions linked in the description below. So we have the base and the 4 dividers. Now on the dividers, I wanted to give it a little bit of a curved detail, so I marked about 1 inch up on the side and used my painter's tape to give me the curvature that I wanted to cut, which I cut off using the jigsaw. I am using a top and bottom cut blade, and I absolutely love this blade and highly recommend it because it gives you a clean cut on both faces of the board. After one of the dividers was cut, I used that to draw the shape onto the rest of the dividers, and then I cut those up as well. Now that all of these dividers are cut, you can put them together, and there are variations just because we used a jigsaw to make those cuts. So I'm going to tape them up together and just use my sander to sand down any unevenness that I see or feel, and basically just smooth out all of the sides of the dividers and then sand the front and the back as well. Now to assemble, I'm using a countersinking drill bit. I applied a little bit of glue and aligned the first divider onto the base. I clamped it together and then made my countersunk hole and added a 1 1/4 inch wood screw. You do want to make sure that the wood screw goes underneath the surface. Now, it is important to wipe off as much of the wood glue as possible because later it's going to be really tight to come in there and wipe off any glue. Now for the spacing, one of the dividers is at 1.5 inch spacing, so I am using 2 1x2 boards to create that spacing and align the divider and attach that using countersinking wood screws. Next up, I have the spacing at 1 inch. For this, I am using 1/2 inch plywood strips, so I have 2 of them. So now I can clamp that next divider in place and attach that as well. Now for the final divider, that's pretty straightforward. You can just align it to the edge and attach it as well. And that's pretty much it. It's built. I applied an oil-based finish to bring out the rich color of the mahogany, and that is the cutting board stand. It makes a great gift for anyone who loves to display their cutting boards. Now the next gift idea is a toddler book wagon or cart. Now this uses a bunch of different dimensions of lumber, and I have the detailed plans with schematics and cut lists for you, and those are linked in the description below. Now for the sides, I wanted the shape of a triangle with a rounded top. So I measured and marked the center of the board and extended that out to the sides to create that triangle. To create the rounded top, I used my stain can to draw the round. I do want both of the sides to be identical, so I clamped both of them together, made sure they were aligned, and then cut it out using a jigsaw. Now once again, I am using a top and bottom cut blade in the jigsaw so that I get a clean cut line on both sides of my board. And now we've got two identical sides. This was a great time to sand down the board, so I sanded all of the boards down to 150 grit. At this point, I remembered that the center divider needed a handle, so I measured and marked for that, made some starter holes with my drill so that I could fit the jigsaw blade into it, and cut out the handle. Since this was a kid's wagon, I decided to round out all of the top edges. So I used a 3/8 inch roundover bit in my trim router and routed out all of the top edges of the boards as well as inside the handle. Next up are pocket holes, which are made only on the bottom of the divider and all four sides of the base. The first step is to attach the divider to the base, so I measured and marked exactly where that would go so it was centered and square, and clamped it in place and added my pocket hole screws. Now this is a good time to fill in those pocket hole screws because later it would be really impossible to get in there and fill them up. So I used my favorite method, which is a dowel, and now we've got some nice clean filled up pocket holes. Now I can go ahead and attach both of the sides, which are also attached using pocket hole screws from the bottom of the base. Now it's time to attach the sides. The sides are attached using wood glue and finished nails. So before we attach the sides, we want to measure and mark exactly where all of these sides and supports go so that it is a lot easier to align everything, as well as we will know exactly where to add those finished nails. The printable plans will tell you exactly where to measure and mark. Now once everything's marked on the sides, I can attach them to the base using pocket hole screws. Now I'm going to go ahead and align the top book supports into place with the measurements we had marked and attach using finished nails. And then I just repeat that all around, adding finished nails so that all of the dividers, the book supports, everything is attached to the sides. And there is the finished wagon. Since I'm going to be painting it, I filled up all of the visible nail holes, sealed all of the knots, and added a couple coats of primer. It can be a little hard to get into all of the tight spaces, but a brush and a roller combination and a little bit of primer in the hair works perfectly. I gave it a couple coats of soft green paint, and I added some 1-inch casters. And it is done. It is a compact bookshelf, which is great for small spaces like a living room where you can keep a small selection of books or toys for the kids to access, and they can move it around and bring them around the house with them. We're going to be making a book stand, and this is a book stand that holds a coffee table book open or a cookbook open while you're cooking. And this is more intended for display purposes, and I think it makes a great gift. The best thing about this is when you're not using it, you can take it apart and it stores flat. Or it's flat and easy to wrap it up to give as a gift. Let's get started. So for this, I am using 1x8 boards that I've already cut to 15 inches long. Now, what we need to do is we need to create slots on each of these so that they kind of fit in together. Now, I am using a circular saw that I'm setting to 45 degrees, but you could totally accomplish this using a table saw as well. So now on here, what we're going to do is we're going to go 4.5 inches from the bottom. And then we're going to cut a slot that is half the width of this. And the thickness of the slot is going to be the exact thickness of the board. So I'm going to clamp the board really tight and use a straight edge to guide the circular saw. Now, at this point, you want to make sure that you align the saw blade to the first cut line such that the curve of the blade is on the inside of the cut. And we're going to go ahead and make that cut all the way to the middle. With that cut done, I'm going to go to the next cut line, make sure that the saw curve is inside of the cut area, and then make that cut all the way to the middle. With those two end cuts done, now I can just go ahead and make a bunch of cuts between those two cuts and remove as much material as possible. Now, when you turn the board over, you will see that the cut has not gone all the way to the middle of the board. And this is because of the shape of the saw blade. So I'm going to draw exactly where the cuts were supposed to be and complete all of those cuts. Those are two boards that are cut the identical way. Now you do see that in the middle there is still a lot of material left, and this is basically because of the shape of the saw blade. So to remove all of that, I'm just going to use a chisel and clean everything out. Now it's time to try this out. It is a little bit tight fitting, which is actually a good thing, but I did need to use a mallet to sort of get it to go together. But it works. Now I can take it apart, give it a nice sanding to clean it all up. To sand the insides of the slot, I figured out that I could just use a pencil wrapped with sandpaper to really get into that tight spot. And I applied pre-stain conditioner and some stain and a top coat, and that is the book stand. It is a great way to display a book that anyone wants to highlight. Okay, next up, we are going to be building a passive phone amplifier. Now, it is passive because there are no electronics involved. The way it works, and you must have seen it or used it yourself, where you put your phone into a cup and it sort of amplifies the sound. Now, when you do something like that, what really is happening is all of the sound waves are bouncing off of the walls and they are interfering with each other and amplifying each other. So every frequency interferes and amplifies itself. Now, that only happens with the higher frequencies, not the lower frequencies, because the lower frequencies have a much higher wavelength. So that is why when you hear the sound, it isn't going to be the best quality. So if you're looking for something that amplifies the bass and makes all of the beats nice and deep, you probably don't want to use this option. But in general, it works pretty well. It amplifies the sound pretty decently. So we are going to be making this out of wood, and I'm going to be using plywood because I have a whole bunch of scrap plywood that really needs to be used up. And I am going to make it like a block of plywood, and we can showcase the edge of the plywood as well. Now, the key part of making this work is you want to have the sound constrained into a smaller space before it opens up so that it gets time to amplify itself and then push out. So to do that, we are going to have multiple layers of plywood, and each layer is going to have a different opening until the sound comes out. Now, the first layer is obviously going to be where you're going to put your phone in, and the width of that slit is going to be the width of your phone. So you want to measure the width of your phone and make it about 1/4 inch larger than that. Next layer is going to have a little bit of a narrower width, and then we're going to have another layer with a very small width. And then we're going to have a layer where it's going to open up to let the sound through. This is 4.5 inch wide. So I'm just going to cut it into squares, 4.5 inch square pieces of plywood. So that's going to be our phone amplifier. Let's get to work. So once I cut down all of the plywood into my squares, it is time to measure and mark exactly where the cuts and the slits are going to be. The first thing you want to do is mark the center of the board, and then we're going to measure and mark all of the slits around that so that everything is symmetrical. It is very important to make all of these measurements as precise as possible, and I do want to give a shout out to my multi-mark tool, which makes it so much easier to measure and transfer measurements between the layers. On the second layer, I do want to point out you want to make sure that the layer does not cover up the speakers at the bottom of the phone. Now, the third layer has a small opening that opens up into a speaker, and the fourth layer is just the opening for the speaker. Now we need to make all of the cuts, and for that I'm going to be using my drill to drill holes to accommodate the jigsaw plate, and then of course cutting it all with the jigsaw. Now it's a little bit tricky with cutting all of these slots out because you barely have enough space to clamp, because you don't want to interfere with the jigsaw either. So it took a bit of iteration. I clamped on the corners, and bit by bit I was able to make all of the cuts. Okay, so here's what we have. We have the full width for the cell phone to fit in. Next, we have a small step down, still keeping the speakers of the phone open. Then we have a smaller hole that opens up down here. And then we have another one with the opening, and of course the bottom. And now that everything is cut, it is time to sand all of the pieces down. To get into those tight spaces, I used my hack of wrapping a pencil and sandpaper, and then I also had to break out my rotary tool to really get in there and sand all of the corners. And then I applied wood glue on each layer and glued them up together one by one. I made sure to wipe off any glue squeeze out at every step because it will be almost impossible to clean it up later. Then I clamped everything together and allowed it to dry overnight. The next day, since the glue had dried, I took the clamps off and I gave the entire thing a sanding to remove any glue residues or remove any unevenness. And because I wanted to soften all of the corners and edges of this cube, I used a 1/4 inch roundover bit in my trim router to round out all of the edges. I used a finishing oil to bring out all of the layers of the plywood, and the phone amplifier is done. The phone amplifier works great, but don't take my word for it. Here is the data. As you can see from the readings, there is about a 10 to 15 decibel increase in the volume with the amplifier. I think it makes a great gift for anyone who loves to listen to their phone or music, and especially probably my team. So I want to build a rotating picture frame. With a rotating picture frame, it's pretty straightforward. You have a picture frame which is on an axis, so we can use dowels and put that inside another frame so that the center frame rotates. But the one part that I think is going to be super challenging, and I had to give it a lot of thought to figure out exactly how to make it work, is the fact that the picture frame needs to be double-sided, right? And you want to be able to change out the pictures when you need to. So I did a little bit of research, a little bit of figuring out, and I think I've got it. I set up my table saw blade to a height of 1/8 of an inch and set up my fence such that the groove that I was going to be cutting would be in the center of the 1x2. Now I am using a 1x2 for both the exterior and the interior frame, and for the interior frame I'm making the cut along the entire 1x2 so that I have a consistent groove and I don't have to worry about making sure that it is reproducible. And then I went over to my miter saw and set the bevel to 45 degrees and made the cuts on that 1x2 to create the sides of my interior frame. Now the best way to do this is to make one cut and flip the board over so you get the same direction of the cut. The key is to not have to change the direction of the saw so you get the consistent angle. And of course you want to always make sure that you are aligning your saws. Now I've got all of the pieces ready for the frame and it looks great. I measured the exact size of the plexiglass I needed and I cut that out using a box cutter. This one's pretty thin, but if you have a thicker plexiglass, you might want to use a jigsaw. And of course, you would have to adjust the width of the groove accordingly as well. You just want to make sure that 2 pieces of plexiglass can fit into the groove comfortably, not too tight and not too loose, but can move around comfortably. Okay, now on this frame, on one of the sides, I'm going to make a groove that goes all the way through so we can pass the pictures into it. So it's going to be exactly identical to this, but on this side, and obviously it's not going to go to the ends, it's just going to be a little groove in here. I use my multi-mark tool to measure and transfer the exact dimensions of the groove onto the other side of the board.
It is a little critical to get all of these measurements just right so you have the perfect groove to pass your pictures through. I clamped the board and used a 1/8 inch drill bit to make some starter holes to fit the jigsaw blade. Now, because a 1/8 inch drill bit is not big enough, I did have to make multiple holes right next to each other and also tilt the drill bit a little bit to get the hole large enough to fit the jigsaw blade into it. When cutting this can be a little bit tricky because number one, you don't have a lot of space, as well as you want to make sure that you get the best possible straight line cut because that will be visible on the outside of the picture frame. I found that the best way to do this was to just cut the straight lines on both sides and then use the drill bit to make the corners of that slot, and 2 pieces of plexiglass pass through comfortably and smoothly. Now it's time to build the frame. I laid down some painter's tape and all of the pieces right next to each other as tightly as possible. I added a bunch of wood glue on each of the corners and rolled it up to build my frame. Of course, as always, you want to measure for square and correct for it. In my case, it was just a little bit off, so I fixed for that and let it dry overnight. And that is the main picture frame. It works perfectly with the 2 pieces of acrylic, and actually it makes for a great 2-sided standalone picture frame as well. I cleaned and sanded off all of the glue residue from the frame, and now it's time to cut the dowels for the rotating part. I am using 3/8 inch dowel, which I cut down to 1 inch pieces using an oscillating tool. I made a hole for the dowel on the top and bottom of the exterior frame using a 3/8 inch drill bit. This hole does not go all the way through, it's only about halfway through the board. On the actual picture frame, I marked the exact center on both the top and the bottom, and I made a hole there as well. The key to getting the hole at the precise location is to use a brad point drill bit. And now this is a great time to do a dry fit. To put the exterior frame together, I decided to use dowels, and so I used my dowel jig to make the holes and get ready to put it together. Now you can use finished nails instead, it's just that I did not want any nail heads to be visible on the outside. I stained and applied finish to all of the parts of the frame and then put it together. You want to go bottom up, so I attached the side to the bottom using dowel plugs and wood glue. And then I added the rotating dowel into the hole, added my frame and the top rotating dowel as well. And now I'm just going to go ahead and add some dowel plugs and add in the top of the frame. And that is it. Now I can take off the protective coating from the plexiglass, sandwich 2 pictures between the plexiglass, and put it into the frame. And that is the rotating picture frame. And yes, I do see the slight misalignment on the bottom. It looks like the dowel isn't sitting properly, but for the first pass, I am excited about the concept working.
And there you have it. 5 easy DIY gift ideas that are unique and you can build this weekend. I do have the plans for all of these projects linked in the description below. And don't forget to check out my friends' videos for even more amazing fun gift ideas. I have them both linked in the description below. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.